The year is 1583. The kingdom of Ndongo, in the vast lands of what is now northern Angola, is alive with the sounds of its people, warriors sharpening their blades, traders haggling in the marketplace, and whispers of destiny weaving their way through the royal palace. A child is born into the heart of this powerful kingdom. A girl. She is given the name Nzinga Annabella Boundayalala. Few could have predicted the storm that lay within her. Few could have known that this child, born into a world dominated by kings and warlords, would one day stand at the crossroads of history, challenging empires, defying expectations, and reshaping the fate of her people. But destiny has a strange way of marking its chosen ones, and from the moment of her birth, Nzinga's path was unlike any other. Her grandfather, Ngola Colombo Kia Kasenda, was a king, a ruler of warriors, a leader of a proud people. Under his reign, Ndongo stood strong against foreign powers, but the world was changing. The Portuguese had come, not as visitors, but as conquerors. They brought with them firepower, greed, and a hunger that could not be satisfied. The land of Ndongo, rich in resources and human strength, had become a prize in the growing transatlantic slave trade. Nzinga was born into a kingdom teetering on the edge of war, but she was no ordinary child. The stories say she entered the world with the umbilical cord wrapped around her neck, an omen, some whispered, a sign of misfortune. But her mother, the queen, saw something else. She saw resilience. She saw the spirit of a survivor. As a girl, Nzinga listened. She watched. She learned. While other children played, she studied the ways of the court, the strategies of battle, the art of negotiation. She knew that the world was not kind to women, but she also knew something more. Power was not given, it was taken. Her father, King Kiluanji, saw her sharp mind and keen instincts. Unlike her brothers, who were raised as warriors, Nzinga was trained in the art of diplomacy. She learned to speak Portuguese fluently, an uncommon skill among her people, and she mastered the delicate balance of negotiation and force. The Portuguese were enemies, but they were also a tool, a force that could be manipulated if one knew how. But power within a kingdom is never secure. When Nzinga's father died, the throne did not pass to her. Instead, it went to her brother, Mbandi. He was not the ruler their people needed. He was weak, uncertain, desperate for legitimacy. And in his desperation, he made a decision that would shape the course of Nzinga's life forever. To secure his throne, Mbandi ordered the death of Nzinga's only son, a child, innocent, helpless. The betrayal ran deep, but Nzinga did not break. She did not beg for mercy. Instead, she did what she had always done. She watched, she learned, and she waited. The Portuguese were tightening their grip on Ndongo, demanding more slaves, more land, more control. Mbandi, weak and afraid, did what Nzinga never would. He bowed. But the Portuguese were not satisfied. They wanted more, always more. And so, in 1622, with her people on the brink of ruin, Nzinga was sent to the Portuguese colonial governor as an ambassador. It was meant to be a mission of surrender, but Nzinga had never been one to kneel. When she arrived in Luanda, the Portuguese did not offer her a seat. It was their way of showing dominance, of reminding her that she was lesser in their eyes. But Nzinga did not falter. Instead, she called for one of her attendants, who knelt on the floor and became her chair. Sitting tall, regal, unshaken, she met the governor's gaze and spoke not as a defeated emissary, but as a queen. She negotiated not just with words, but with presence. She made them listen. She won the respect of her enemies. And when she returned to Ndongo, she was no longer just a diplomat. She was something far greater. Because Nzinga had learned the most important lesson of all. Power is never given, power is taken, and she was ready to take it all. The drums of Ndongo echoed through the night, their deep rhythms speaking the language of the ancestors. Firelight flickered across the palace walls as a young girl sat beside her father, her sharp eyes studying every movement, every word, every decision. This was no ordinary child. This was Nzinga, favored daughter of King Colombo, a child of prophecy, a girl whose very birth had been marked by fate. The whispers had started the day she was born. Her mother, Kengalaka Nkombe, had labored through an agonizing birth, the umbilical cord wrapped around the infant's throat like a noose. But the child had not surrendered to the darkness. She had fought. She had survived. And in the old traditions of the Mbundu people, that meant something. It meant power. It meant destiny. Her name, Nzinga, was not just a name. It was a declaration, a reminder that she had entered this world through struggle and that she would thrive within it the same way. Nzinga was not like the other royal children. She had two sisters, Kambu and Fungi, and a brother Mbandi, the heir to the throne. But unlike them, she was different. She was not bound by the rigid expectations of the court. She was not a pawn in a political game. She was her father's shadow, his student, his warrior. From the moment she could walk, she was given a battle axe. It was not a toy. It was not a lesson in etiquette or refinement. It was a weapon, and she wielded it with an instinct beyond her years. The warriors of Ndongo trained her alongside the young princes, their sweat mixing with hers in the heat of combat. They watched as she learned the art of war, not just in strength, but in strategy. While others relied on brute force, Nzinga understood something deeper. War was not just about the clash of metal, it was about the mind. It was about knowing when to strike and when to wait. And wait, she did. At just 10 years old, she watched her father ascend to the throne. King Colombo was a man of power, but he was also a man who saw the storm on the horizon. The Portuguese had come, bringing with them promises wrapped in lies, treaties soaked in blood. They wanted land, they wanted wealth, and above all, they wanted slaves. Ndongo was a kingdom of warriors, but even warriors could fall to treachery. And so, while her father fought battles on the field, Nzinga fought battles of the mind. She sat in legal councils, learning the intricacies of leadership. She joined war councils, understanding the delicate balance between diplomacy and domination. She watched, she listened, and she learned. Most girls in the royal court were destined for marriage, their futures tied to alliances and duty. Nzinga was different. Her father saw something in her, a sharpness, a hunger. He did not treat her as a daughter. He treated her as a successor in everything but name. And so, while others underestimated her, she prepared. She learned to read and write in Portuguese from visiting missionaries, understanding the language of her enemies before they even realized she was listening. She memorized their tactics, their weaknesses, their ambitions. She did not trust them, but she knew that knowledge was its own kind of power. The Portuguese believed that Africa was theirs to take, that the kingdoms of the Mbundu were mere stepping stones on their path to conquest, but they had not yet met Nzinga. Because she was not just a princess, she was not just a warrior, she was something far greater, and when the time came, the world would know her name. The land of Ndongo was bleeding. By the late 1500s, its once great kingdom was trapped in the iron grip of war. The Portuguese had come, not as guests, not as allies, but as invaders. They had built their strongholds, carved out their territories, and unleashed a hunger that could never be satisfied. They did not come for gold. They did not come for peace. They came for people. 50,000 lives stolen, fathers ripped from their families, children torn from their homes, warriors chained like animals. The land itself trembled beneath the weight of suffering. Villages burned, rivers ran red, and the kingdom of Ndongo stood at the edge of oblivion. But there was one force they had not yet broken, one name they would soon learn to fear, Ngola Njinga. To the Portuguese, she was Queen Nzinga. To her people, she was something more, a leader, a protector, a warrior forged in fire. She had studied their ways, learned their language, and watched as her enemies underestimated her. Now, she would teach them a lesson they would never forget. She had spent her childhood at the side of kings, listening to the whispers of war councils and the secrets of diplomacy. She had learned the blade and the pen, knowing that both could be weapons. And when the throne passed to her weak-willed brother, Mbandi, she saw what her people had feared for years. Ndongo was crumbling. The Portuguese had set their sights on complete domination. They had already taken Congo. They had already turned entire lands into a machine of suffering, feeding their endless thirst for slaves. And Mbandi, desperate to hold on to power, made a choice that no true ruler would ever make. He bowed. He sent gifts to the Portuguese governor in Luanda, hoping to buy time. He offered slaves, his own people, hoping to buy mercy. But mercy was not in the nature of conquerors. The Portuguese wanted more, always more. And so, in 1622, Mbandi called upon the one person who had never bowed, who had never surrendered. Nzinga. She was sent as an ambassador. It was supposed to be a mission of submission, a plea for peace, but Nzinga did not kneel. When she arrived in Luanda, the Portuguese governor made his intentions clear. She was not his equal. He did not even offer her a chair, forcing her to stand before him like a servant. But Nzinga had spent her life preparing for this moment. She did not waver. She did not shrink. Instead, she turned to one of her attendants, who immediately knelt before her. Without hesitation, Nzinga sat upon the back of her servant, raising herself to eye level with the governor. She would not be looked down upon. The message was clear. She was no subordinate. She was a queen. And when she spoke, she did so with the full weight of her people behind her. She negotiated not as a victim, but as a ruler. She spoke of peace, of trade, of cooperation. And for a moment, the Portuguese listened. They agreed to her terms. They promised an alliance. They spoke of diplomacy. But Nzinga had spent enough time around the Portuguese to know one thing: their word was worth nothing. The moment she returned home, she prepared for war, because power was never given. It was taken. Ndongo had always been a land of warriors, a kingdom forged in strength, tempered in battle, but now the land was drowning in blood. In 1590, Ndongo had fought back. Against all odds, its warriors clashed with the Portuguese at the Battle of Lucala, striking a rare victory against the foreign invaders. But victories in war mean nothing when the kingdom itself is crumbling. For every battle won, more land was lost. For every Portuguese soldier slain, another fort was built. The Portuguese had not just come with muskets and steel, they came with something far more dangerous: corruption. Ndongo's noblemen, the Sobas, had once been loyal to the throne. They had paid their tribute, followed their king, fought for their people. But now, some had turned. Some saw the power of Portugal and bent the knee, hoping for protection, hoping for profit. Loyalty was fading. The kingdom was divided, and by the time Nzinga's father took the throne in 1593, he was not ruling a kingdom. He was ruling over ruins. His power was weak, his enemies were growing, and the land itself was scarred by war. He tried everything. He sought peace. He tried to negotiate. He sent messengers, offered treaties, even waged open war. Nothing worked, because Ndongo was not just at war with Portugal. A new enemy had come, a force unlike anything the kingdom had seen before. The Imbangala. They were not an empire. They were not an army. They were something worse. Warriors without a home. Mercenaries with no loyalty. A tide of destruction that moved from land to land, leaving only ash behind. They did not fight for kings. They fought for blood. They captured slaves by the thousands, tearing through villages like a firestorm. They lived by a brutal code. Only the strongest survived. Only the ruthless could rule. And in 1607, they came for Ndongo. The Portuguese, seeing an opportunity, did not fight them. They hired them. The invaders of yesterday had become the allies of today. And now, Ndongo was surrounded. To the north, the Portuguese forts stood like unbreakable walls, controlling trade, controlling the rivers, controlling life itself. To the south, the Imbangala warbands raged through the land, capturing, killing, destroying. Ndongo's king had no options left. The dream of reclaiming lost land was over. The fight for survival had begun. And in the shadows of this collapsing world, Nzinga watched. She saw the betrayal of the Sobas. She saw the weakness of her father. She saw the rise of the Imbangala. And she knew one thing with absolute certainty: If Ndongo was to survive, it would not be through treaties. It would not be through mercy. It would be through something far greater, something only she could bring. The throne of Ndongo had always been soaked in blood. But when Ngola Mbandi Kiluanji died in 1617, the bloodshed did not come from war, it came from within. His son, Ngola Mbandi, ascended to power, and with him came a reign of terror. Months of political executions followed, rivals, nobles, anyone who could challenge his rule. No one was safe, even family. His older half-brother was the first to die, along with every member of his household. The message was clear: there would be no competition. Then came Nzinga's turn. At 35, she was no innocent bystander. She had been raised in the corridors of power, trained in war and diplomacy. But even she was not prepared for what her brother did next. He did not kill her. Instead, he took from her what she could never get back. Nzinga's young son, murdered on his order. Her body, forever changed, sterilized, ensuring she would never bear another child. Her sisters suffered the same fate. The pain was not just physical, it was deeper, cutting through bloodlines, erasing futures. It was meant to destroy more than her body. It was meant to destroy her legacy. And so, she ran. With nowhere else to turn, she sought refuge in Matamba, a kingdom ruled by warrior queens, where power was not determined by birthright alone. But exile did not mean weakness. Nzinga was patient. She had lost everything, her home, her son, her future as a mother, but she had not lost herself. And in 1621, her chance came. Mbandi had declared war on the Portuguese, swearing to push them from Ndongo. But war is not won by words. It is won by strategy, by alliances, by wisdom. And Mbandi had none of these things. The Portuguese crushed his forces. Their power was absolute. Even the Mbangala, the savage warbands he had hoped to use, could not turn the tide. Mbandi had only one option left. He called for the one person he had once betrayed, Nzinga. It was not an apology. It was not an admission of guilt. It was desperation. He needed her, not as a sister, not as an equal, but as an emissary. Someone who could speak to the Portuguese on his behalf, someone who understood their ways, someone who could do what he could not. And Nzinga agreed, but not without conditions. Vichy would negotiate, but she would do it her way. She would go to Luanda, but she would go as an equal. She would serve her people, but she would never kneel. With a grand entourage, she left for the capital. Every step was calculated, every move intentional. And when she arrived, the Portuguese took notice. They expected submission. They expected humility. They expected a woman defeated by exile and suffering. Instead, they saw a queen. She did not wear European gowns like the other ambassadors before her. She did not dress in Portuguese silks, did not bend to foreign customs. She arrived draped in the riches of her own land, feathers, jewels, the vibrant fabrics of Ndongo. She was not here to become them. She was here to remind them who she was. And when the meeting began, the Portuguese governor made his stance clear. He would not treat her as an equal. There were chairs for the Portuguese, and for Nzinga, a mat on the floor, a simple insult, a calculated move. To them, she was a conquered leader, a mere woman in the world of men. But Nzinga had spent her entire life preparing for moments like this. Without hesitation, she turned to one of her attendants. The man knelt, forming himself into a human chair. Nzinga sat, her posture regal, her gaze unwavering. She would not be looked down upon. She spoke, and the room listened. Her words were sharp, her presence undeniable. She flattered when necessary, commanded when required, and above all, she negotiated not from a position of weakness, but from power. The Portuguese saw it. They had come expecting a plea for mercy. What they got instead was something far more dangerous, a queen who knew exactly how to play their game. In the grand halls of Luanda, Nzinga stood as more than just an ambassador. She was a strategist, a woman who understood the art of power. The Portuguese wanted submission. She offered them something far more enticing, partnership. Her words were measured, her tone composed. She spoke of peace, of alliances, of shared prosperity. She assured them that the hostilities of the past were merely the mistakes of a young king, a leader not yet wise in the ways of the world. It was a lie, but a necessary one. To sweeten the deal, she made a shocking offer. Ndongo would allow Portuguese slave traders to operate within its borders. A sacrifice, one that sickened her, but one she knew would buy her kingdom time. In return, she demanded the removal of Portuguese forts from her homeland. But there was one thing she would not give: tribute. Only the conquered pay tribute, and Nzinga refused to let Ndongo be seen as conquered. The Portuguese hesitated. They had heard promises before. So Nzinga gave them something they could not ignore: herself. She would be baptized, not out of faith, not out of belief, but out of strategy. She knelt in a grand ceremony, draped in the robes of a believer, accepting the name Dona Ana de Souza in honor of her godparents, the governor and his wife. The Portuguese saw devotion, Nzinga saw victory. A peace treaty was signed. And in 1622, she returned to Cabasa not as a mere diplomat, but as the woman who had done what no man before her could: secure peace with the Portuguese. She was celebrated, praised. But peace is only as strong as those who uphold it, and war does not always wait for treaties. Ndongo was bleeding, not from the Portuguese, but from within. The Mbangala, the ruthless war bands that had once been mercenaries, were no longer content to be hired swords. They wanted land, they wanted power, and so they took it. They stormed Cabasa, the very heart of the kingdom, tearing through the royal city with the same savagery they had once inflicted on Portuguese enemies. The king, Mbandi, fled into exile. The royal court scattered. In the chaos, a new kingdom was born, Kasanje, ruled by the very warriors who had once fought for Ndongo. The Portuguese, bound by the treaty, refused to intervene. Not until Mbandi retook his throne, not until he himself was baptized. Mbandi, paranoid and desperate, did not trust them. And so Nzinga played her final card. She whispered in his ear, cautioning him against baptism, reminding him of the traditionalists who still held power in the kingdom. Perhaps she meant to protect him. Perhaps she meant to ensure that the throne would one day be hers. But by 1624, it no longer mattered, because King Mbandi had fallen into despair. The weight of war, of betrayal, of humiliation, it was too much. And soon the throne of Ndongo would stand empty once again. In the year 1624, the throne of Ndongo stood empty. King Mbandi was dead. Some whispered that grief had driven him to take his own life. Others were certain of a darker truth: poison, a silent, patient hand that had guided him to his grave, a hand that belonged to his sister, Nzinga. She moved swiftly, decisively. There was no time for hesitation. Her first act was to seize the sacred symbols of power, the relics that bound the kingdom together. Without them, no ruler could claim true authority, and she was not about to let them fall into the hands of her rivals. A grand funeral was held for her brother. The mourning was extravagant, the display of sorrow convincing. His body was laid to rest, but Nzinga ensured that a part of him remained, his bones preserved in a sacred reliquary so his spirit could be consulted. A king's wisdom, even in death, could still serve the living. But there was one problem: a boy, Mbandi's son, the rightful heir, a child too young to rule yet old enough to be a threat. He was in the hands of Kasa, a powerful warlord of the Mbangala, a man who had no loyalty beyond what benefited him. Nzinga did not send assassins. She did not call for war. Instead, she sent a proposal: marriage. Kasa, like many warriors, believed in strength above all else, and what could be stronger than a queen who had risen from exile to claim a kingdom? The wedding was a spectacle, a declaration to the nobles of Ndongo that she was not merely a woman seeking power, she was a ruler securing her reign. And once the celebrations had ended, once the feasting had faded and the wine had run dry, Nzinga acted. Her nephew was dead before the sun rose. The boy who might have one day challenged her was gone, just as her own son had been taken from her all those years ago. With the last blood tie to her brother severed, She stood alone. The throne was hers, but power in Ndongo was never simply given. It had to be taken. Her enemies, noblemen who had spent their lives believing that no woman could rule, saw her as an interloper, a pretender. She was the daughter of a slave wife, not of the first wife, not of the chosen line. They called her weak. They called her unworthy. And most of all, they called her something she would never forgive: a coward, a ruler who sought peace instead of war, a leader who would kneel before the Portuguese instead of fighting them. They did not yet understand. Nzinga had no intention of kneeling. She was not a ruler who begged. She was a ruler who conquered. The halls of power in Ndongo trembled with unrest. Nzinga had claimed the throne, but holding it was a different battle altogether. The nobles of her court, powerful men who had ruled from the shadows, whispered their defiance. They had bent the knee to kings before her, but a queen, that was something they could not accept. But Nzinga was not concerned with their murmurs. She had greater battles to fight. Across the land, Portugal's grip tightened. The treaty she had signed in 1621, the fragile hope of peace, was beginning to unravel. Governor João Correia de Sousa had once been an ally, a man willing to negotiate, but power had a way of changing men, and the Portuguese, no matter their words, had never viewed Ndongo as an equal. When Nzinga demanded the return of her people, her Kijikos, a servile caste who had been stolen and taken to Portuguese lands, the governor refused. Instead, he turned the tables. "Return our slaves first," he commanded. Nzinga's warriors, the men and women who had fought and bled for her, were seen as nothing more than property in Portuguese eyes. And the insult did not stop there. The governor demanded that she kneel, that she bow her head before the King of Portugal, swear fealty, and pay tribute. A queen made into a vassal, a ruler reduced to a servant. Nzinga's response was swift. No. The word rang out like the strike of a battle drum. No tribute, no surrender, no submission. But while Nzinga held her ground, the Portuguese were already moving against her. De Sousa turned his attention to the Sobas, the powerful noble lords who ruled Ndongo's provinces. These men had once sworn loyalty to the king of Ndongo, providing warriors and wealth to the throne. But De Sousa had a different vision. One by one, he offered them something Nzinga could not: power, independence, the chance to rule without answering to a queen. And one by one, they betrayed her. The very foundation of her kingdom, her control over the nobility, was crumbling. Ndongo was at the edge of a knife. Nzinga could see the war coming. She had no choice but to fight. But she would not fight on Portugal's terms. She would not meet them in open battle, where their firearms and European tactics would give them the advantage. Nzinga would fight as she had always fought, cleverly, ruthlessly. She would fight like a queen who had learned from birth that the only way to survive was to strike first. Nzinga had always known the game of power was never won by strength alone. It was won by wit, by patience, by knowing exactly when to strike. And now, the time to strike had come. To the Portuguese, her kingdom was little more than a supplier of human bodies, slaves torn from their lands, forced to work in distant plantations, their lives traded for gold and muskets. But Nzinga understood something the Portuguese did not. She understood that the true power of a kingdom was not in the land it held, nor in the battles it won. It was in the people who believed in it. So she sent out her Makunzes, swift-footed messengers who carried her words to the enslaved. "Come home," she told them. "Come to your queen." And they did. One by one, the enslaved Mbande left the Portuguese plantations under the cover of darkness. They fled the brutal hands of their captors, the iron chains that bound them. They ran towards freedom. They ran towards Nzinga. And as they gathered under her banner, her kingdom grew stronger. But strength invited enemies. The Portuguese had taken note of her defiance. At first, they tried to reason with her. They sent envoys demanding she return their property. Nzinga's response was as cunning as it was infuriating. "We have no escaped slaves," she said. And yet, her army swelled, her fields flourished, her kingdom thrived. The Portuguese saw this for what it was: an act of war. And they were not the only ones who wished to see her fall. Among the Mbande nobles, there were those who had never accepted her rule. One among them, a man named Hari Akiluanje, claimed that a woman had no right to rule Ndongo. He carried royal blood in his veins. He called for rebellion, and the Portuguese, seeing an opportunity, answered his call. They sent their soldiers to protect him. They armed his men. They whispered into his ear, promising him the throne. Nzinga saw the betrayal unfold before her eyes, but she did not waver. She raised her warriors and marched against the rebel Kiluanje. She would crush him before his treachery could spread. But the battle did not go as planned. Her forces met his in open combat, and the battle axes of Ndongo clashed against Portuguese steel. Smoke and blood filled the air. The cries of the wounded echoed across the battlefield, and in the end, Nzinga's army was forced to retreat. The loss sent ripples through her court. Nobles who had once sworn loyalty to her now turned their backs. Fear crept into the hearts of her allies. And then, the final blow came. On March 15, 1626, the Portuguese no longer hid behind their puppets. They declared war. Nzinga was no longer just a queen. She was now a hunted enemy. And as the forces of Portugal prepared to march against her, she realized one chilling truth. She had lost her kingdom. But Nzinga had never been one to surrender. Number if war was what they wanted, then war was what she would give them. Nzinga had lost the throne, but she had not lost the war. With her warriors at her side, she retreated deep into the heart of her homeland, to the islands of the Kwanza River. The land was harsh, but it was safe, for now. Then the Portuguese came. They marched on her stronghold, steel gleaming, muskets loaded. Battle after battle raged across the islands. Blood soaked the earth. The river ran red. And in the end, she was forced to retreat once more. This time, the journey was even harder. Through thick jungles, across unforgiving terrain, Nzinga led her army east. The march was brutal. Food was scarce. Many of her people fell behind. But she did not stop. She could not stop. And so, step by step, she disappeared into the depths of Ndongo. The Portuguese thought she was finished. They turned their attention back to the kingdom, placing their puppet king, Ngola Hari, on the throne. But something was wrong. The people did not cheer for their new ruler. The Sobas, noblemen of Ndongo, split into factions. Some accepted the Portuguese-backed king, but many more whispered the same name in the dark, Nzinga. The exiled queen still had her supporters, and she still had her army. The offer they didn't expect in November 1627, a message arrived at the Portuguese court. Nzinga was ready to negotiate. She sent an envoy with a gift, 400 slaves, a fortune in human currency. She had a proposal. She would recognize the King of Portugal as her sovereign. She would pay tribute. She would end her resistance. But there was one condition. Nzinga would be Queen of Ndongo, not their puppet king, not their Portuguese-backed nobleman, Nzinga. For a moment, the Portuguese hesitated. Was she surrendering, or was this another one of her traps? They debated, whispered, plotted. Then they sent their reply. Their answer was as ruthless as it was final. They beheaded her lead diplomat. And with that, the Portuguese made their message clear. Nzinga was not to be queen. She was to be erased. They sent word back, listing their own demands. She was to renounce her claim to Ndongo. She was to submit to Ngola Hari. She was to retire from public life forever. In European courts, these demands were diplomatic norms. To Nzinga, they were unthinkable. She had offered peace. The Portuguese had chosen war. So be it. Nzinga, the exiled queen, was about to make her next move, and this time, she would play by her own rules. Nzinga was outnumbered, outgunned, outmaneuvered. Her kingdom was slipping from her grasp. The Portuguese had dismissed her offer of peace with cold steel. Her nobles, once her allies, now whispered in the shadows, siding with the puppet king, Ngola Hari. And when the Portuguese army struck, they struck hard. The ambush was brutal. Nzinga's warriors fought fiercely, but the enemy was relentless. By the time the dust settled, half of her army was gone. Most of her advisors were either dead or captured, and worst of all, her two beloved sisters had been taken. Nzinga had lost everything: her throne, her soldiers, her family. She disappeared into the wilderness, her forces shattered, her kingdom in the hands of the Portuguese. To the world, it seemed as though the great queen of Ndongo had finally fallen. But they didn't know Nzinga. Not yet. The rebirth of a warrior queen. For weeks, she was silent. She locked herself away, deep in the heart of the land, hidden from her enemies. Some whispered that she was broken, that she would never rise again. But when she emerged, she was not the same queen who had fled from battle. Nzinga had a new plan. If Ndongo was lost, she would build something even greater. A new kingdom, a new empire, one that the Portuguese could never control. And this time, she would play by her own rules. She would become more than a queen. She would become a legend. Nzinga had lost everything: her throne, her people, even her sisters. But she was not done. If Ndongo had been taken from her, she would build something new. And to do that, she needed an army. The Imbangala, a deal with devils. Deep in the heart of Central Africa, Nzinga found them, the Imbangala. They were not like other warriors. They did not fight for kings or lands. They fought for blood, for conquest, for chaos. And their leader, Kasanje, was among the most feared warlords in the region. For years, the Imbangala had been her enemies. They had slaughtered her people, burned her villages. Now, she would stand before them, and she would do the unthinkable. She would become one of them. Kasanje laid out the terms. If she wanted his warriors, she had to marry him and abandon her past. Her royal symbols, gone. Her old ways, forgotten. Nzinga accepted, but this was not surrender. This was strategy. She walked into the lion's den and became a lion herself. The Blood Oath. The initiation was brutal. The Imbangala were not just warriors. They were a cult of war, a brotherhood bound by blood and fire. Nzinga had to prove herself. And the rituals? They were horrific. The drinking of blood, the sacrifice of the weak, the rejection of all family ties. She passed every test, not just as a warrior, but as a leader. She transformed, adopting their brutal military strategies, merging them with the discipline of her own people. She freed escaped slaves and made them soldiers. She offered land and riches to exiled warriors, and with every new recruit, she built something that had never existed before: a new army, a new nation, one that would rise, not as a vassal to the Portuguese, not as a kingdom bound by tradition, but as a warlord empire. And Nzinga? She was no longer just a queen. She was something far more dangerous. She was Nzinga, the warrior of Matamba, and the Portuguese were about to learn her name. Nzinga had lost her kingdom. She had lost her people, but she had gained something far more powerful, an army that feared nothing, and now she was ready to use it. The Amazon Kui. It was 1631, and the Portuguese had grown comfortable. They believed Nzinga was finished, broken, gone. They were wrong. From the shadows, Nzinga struck. She led ambushes on Portuguese caravans, raided settlements, burned fortresses to the ground. No one saw her coming. No one could stop her. Even the Jesuits of Congo, men of God, couldn't help but admire her. One of them called her an Amazon queen, a leader like no other, and she was just getting started. The conquest of Matamba Nzinga needed a kingdom, and she had found one. To the east, the kingdom of Matamba stood strong, a land ruled by another queen, Mwongo Matamba. But Matamba wasn't just land, it was strategic, a perfect base for Nzinga's war. So she did what she did best. She invaded. Her warriors stormed Matamba, tearing through its defenses. Queen Mwongo was defeated. By tradition, Nzinga should have killed her. But instead, she spared her, branded her like cattle, and took her daughter, not as a hostage, but as a warrior. Because Nzinga was not just conquering a kingdom, she was building something new, a fortress of power, a land that would never bow to Portugal. She settled Matamba with exiled Ndongans. She used it as her war capital, and she turned the tables on the Portuguese. War and wealth. With Matamba under her control, Nzinga saw a new opportunity: the slave trade. For years, Portugal had grown rich selling slaves to European markets. Nzinga cut into their profits. She captured slaves before the Portuguese could. She diverted trade routes, and with every deal, she funded her war. The Portuguese had tried to use slavery to break Africa. Nzinga used slavery to break the Portuguese. The king in woman's clothing, but power had its price. Nzinga knew she needed more than just warriors. She needed to command respect, and in a world where kings ruled, she became a king. She abandoned female titles, dressed like a man, took on masculine authority. She built an all-female bodyguard, a deadly force of warriors who lived only to protect her, and as for her concubines, they were men, but she forced them to wear women's clothing, to obey her, to call her king. At her court, no man held power over her. She enforced chastity laws, demanded absolute loyalty, and crushed anyone who dared challenge her rule. Nzinga had started as a queen. Now, she was something else entirely, a king in her own right, a warlord of Matamba, a ruler unlike any before her, and as long as she lived, Matamba would never fall. She had lost a kingdom. She had built an empire. And now, she was ready to reshape history. Nzinga had outlasted kings. She had defied Portugal, but her war was not over. The queen who would not bow by the 1640s, Nzinga was no longer just a warrior. She was a power broker, a ruler whose influence stretched beyond Matamba. She used her army not just to fight battles, but to control politics. When local nobles resisted, she crushed them. When rival factions in neighboring kingdoms fought for power, she picked the winners. Nzinga's warriors were no longer just soldiers. They were kingmakers. And with every alliance she made, her grip on Central Africa grew stronger. The final enemies. But not everyone bowed to Nzinga. In eastern Matamba, an old enemy still lurked: Kasanje's Imbangala warriors. Nzinga had once been their ally. Now they were a threat, so she waged war against them. She marched against the kingdom of Kaka, and wherever she fought, one thing became clear: Nzinga was no longer just defending her lands, she was expanding them, the Queen and the Cross. But there was one war she did not fight with swords, one battle she fought with words, diplomacy, and faith. Nzinga had been baptized as a Christian in 1623. At first, it was just a political move, but something changed. In 1644, her army captured a Portuguese priest. Instead of executing him, she kept him. Then, in 1648, her soldiers captured 2 Spanish Capuchin monks. But these men were different. They weren't Portuguese. They weren't colonial spies. They were true believers. And for the first time, Nzinga saw a version of Christianity that wasn't tied to her enemies. One of them, Father Calixto Zelotes de Reis Mago, became more than just a prisoner. He became her secretary, her advisor, her connection to the Vatican itself. And soon, Nzinga did something no one expected. She asked the Catholic Church for missionaries, not as invaders, but as diplomats. She played Portugal's own religion against them, and in 1661, the impossible happened. The Pope himself, Alexander VII, wrote to Nzinga, praising her. The Queen, who had once fought Christianity, now used it as a weapon of power, a legacy unmatched. Nzinga was old. She had outlived her rivals. She had outlasted wars. And she had done what no one believed was possible. She had made Matamba stronger than Ndongo had ever been. For decades, Portugal had tried to destroy her. Now, they were forced to negotiate with her. Nzinga was no longer just a queen. She was a legend. And her final years would not be spent in war, but in securing the future of her people. Nzinga had won wars. She had built an empire. But her most radical battle? It wasn't fought with swords. It was fought with faith. the Christian queen. By the 1650s, Nzinga was no longer just a warrior. She was a ruler who reshaped cultures. Christianity had once been a tool of the Portuguese. Now, Nzinga made it her own. She brought Christian converts into her court. She built churches across Matamba. She placed crosses in positions of high honor. And just like she had done with the Imbangala warriors, she took Christian customs and blended them into her rule. But not everyone accepted her vision. The war within, to some, Nzinga's Christian court was a betrayal. Traditional religious leaders saw her policies as an attack on their power. They resisted. They pushed back. So Nzinga did what she had always done. She crushed the opposition. She gave her priests authority to burn temples and shrines. She arrested those who opposed her. Some were sentenced to public whippings. Others, Nzinga sold them into slavery, personally requesting that they be sent overseas. And with the profits, she built a church. Nzinga had turned faith into a weapon, but not everyone bowed. The shadow resistance. Some priests escaped her purge. They went into hiding, and from the shadows they worked to undermine her rule. They whispered that she had betrayed her people, that she was no true queen. For the first time, Nzinga faced an enemy she couldn't simply kill, an enemy that worked in secret, an enemy that threatened her legacy. Could she defeat them? Or had she created a war she could never win? For 25 years, Nzinga had waged war against the Portuguese, against rival kings, against those who doubted her rule. But now, she faced her greatest challenge yet, making peace. The long negotiation. By 1650, both Nzinga and the Portuguese were exhausted. The war had drained men, money, and power. Nzinga's kingdom had survived, but at what cost? And the Portuguese? They were distracted, locked in a desperate fight for independence against Spain. Both sides wanted an end, but neither would surrender. A sister's freedom. For Nzinga, peace was about more than land or trade. It was about family. Her sister Kambu, now called Barbara, had been a prisoner for years. Nzinga wanted her back. The Portuguese demanded a ransom. Nzinga refused, and so the war dragged on. The deal is struck then. In 1656, a deal was finally made. Nzinga ceded land on her western border. The Portuguese agreed to respect her rule in Matamba, and most importantly, Nzinga secured a monopoly over the slave trade in her region, turning it into her greatest weapon. And in return, she promised military support to Portugal if needed. It was a treaty of compromise, but it was also a victory. For the first time, Portugal recognized Nzinga as a ruler. She wasn't just a warrior queen anymore. She was a queen of diplomacy. A sister returns. On October 12, 1656, Nzinga's sister finally came home. Led by a Portuguese priest, Barbara stepped into Matamba, free. And in that moment, Nzinga knew her war was finally over. Or was it? Because while peace had come, her kingdom's survival would now depend on what came next. Would Matamba thrive in peace? Or was this just the calm before the final storm? Nzinga had spent a lifetime fighting for her kingdom, for her people, for her legacy. But now, the war was over, and for the first time in decades, Nzinga had to ask herself, what comes after war? Rebuilding a broken land. Ndongo was in ruins. War had burned villages, famine had emptied fields, and thousands had been lost to slavery. But Nzinga refused to let her people fade into history. Instead, she turned to Matamba. It would be her new capital, her new empire, a gateway to wealth, power, and survival. The final transformation. Peace changed more than just the land. It changed Nzinga herself. Gone was the warrior in armor. Gone were the all-male concubines. The queen of battle had become the queen of state. She embraced luxury, diplomacy, and trade. She wore silks from Europe. She welcomed missionaries and scholars. She even did something unthinkable. She married, a Christian ceremony, a final act to show the world. Matamba was not just a warrior's fortress. It was a kingdom meant to last. A new kind of struggle. But not everyone agreed. The warriors who had fought by her side, they saw her new royal policies as betrayal. They wanted a return to the old ways, where strength, not bloodlines, made a ruler. And while Nzinga was powerful, even she could not fight time itself, because soon there was one battle left to face, the battle against death. And the question remained, would Matamba survive without her? Or would her kingdom fall to ruin? For decades, Nzinga had fought to control her own fate. She had defied kings. She had outwitted the Portuguese. She had built a kingdom from the ashes of war. But now, she faced a battle she could not win. The Queen's final days. It started with a whisper of pain, a sickness in her throat. Then, the pain spread to her lungs. By October 1663, she could barely rise from her bed. Her enemies waited. Her allies feared. And Nzinga? She did what she had always done. She fought. But even warriors must rest. And on the morning of December 17, 1663, Nzinga, Queen of Ndongo, and Matamba took her final breath. The legacy she left behind her people mourned. Her enemies watched. But the world? The world had already changed. Because Nzinga had changed it. Her funeral was like no other. Priests prayed, warriors sang. In Matamba, in Luanda, even in the halls of Portuguese power, she was honored, feared, respected. The struggle for her throne. But not all battles end with death. Nzinga had named her sister, Kambu, Dona Barbara, as her heir, a queen chosen by Nzinga herself. But there was a problem. A man stood in the way. Nzinga, a Mona, a warrior, a leader, a man raised in the old ways. Nzinga had feared him because he did not believe in her Christian kingdom. He believed in war, and now that Nzinga was gone, would her sister hold the throne, or would everything Nzinga built be torn apart? The queen was dead, but her legacy, her war, her kingdom, that story was far from over. Nzinga was gone, but her spirit, her story, her power, that would never die. The legend begins the moment she took her final breath. Her name became more than history. It became a legend. The people of Angola spoke of her in hushed whispers, then in proud songs, then in battle cries. For centuries, her name would be a weapon, a symbol of resistance, a queen's shadow in Angola's history. Angola would fall to the Portuguese, but even as they ruled, they could never erase her. By the mid-20th century, as Angola fought for independence, Nzinga rose again, not in body, but in spirit. The fighters of independence called her Mother Angola. They whispered her tactics. They carried her strength. She had once fought to free her people, and now they would fight in her name. The queens who followed Nzinga had once defied the odds. She had fought to rule in a world that rejected female leaders, and yet she won. After her, queens ruled for 80 out of the next 104 years, because she had changed everything. Nzinga had made power possible for the women who followed. A queen who never left today, her name still echoes, in streets named after her, in statues that stand tall in Luanda, in the hearts of Angolan women who lead, fight, and defy expectations. Even the National Reserve Bank of Angola honored her, with a 20 Kwanza coin in her name. Nzinga was more than a queen. She was more than a warrior. She was a force, a vision, a woman who refused to be erased. And today, long after her death, her story still lives. Because legends, they never die. Nzinga's story doesn't end here, because her legacy lives on. And if you found this journey inspiring, share this video with your family, friends, or anyone who loves powerful stories from history. Want more? Check out this next video. I promise you won't regret it. And hey, liking, commenting, sharing, or subscribing? That's up to you. Either way, thank you for watching. You're awesome. See you in the next one.